Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Phil Halford, and I head up the charities team here at BDO. The first thing I wanted to say was that from everyone at BDO, we hope that your respective teams and family members and loved ones are all safe and well. This is our second charity webinar during lockdown, and we've developed this series of webinars to assist our charity clients during this difficult time. So if you couldn't attend the first one that we did a few weeks ago and are keen to get the recording, then please do let us know and we can send you a copy. But just really to set the scene, why are we doing this webinar today? Well, we're in obviously a very difficult, tricky time, and I know a number of my charity clients are experiencing some difficulties with how do they come through this difficult period of COVID and how do they recover and come out of it stronger. You may have seen a survey from the Institute of Fundraising and the Charity Finance Group that was issued across the last couple of weeks that estimated charities would lose $12 billion over the next year, which equates to 20% of their sector's entire income, so a significant amount. When they asked charities who responded to the survey what the next year was looking like, not only did they expect to see a 24% income fall, they were also looking at trading income, which is one of the things that we want to focus on as part of this seminar today. And the average fall on that was anticipated to be 57%, so a significant decrease. And across their voluntary income, which I know a lot of you rely on, an average of 42% fall. So some significant falls or potential falls in income coming. A bit of good news, you'll have seen the press, I'm sure, from yesterday, where the government announced a £1.5 billion additional funding for the arts sector. So for our arts charities out there, that will be a significant help. The detail of that obviously is yet to be announced. You may remember from our first seminar, I highlighted our RETHINK strategy, a framework to try and put some structure around the recovery phase as we plan to come out of lockdown and how our organisations will come out of this stronger or try to. And today I'm joined by some of my fabulous colleagues. You'll see their smiling faces on the screen. They're going to guide you through some of this thinking and some of this support. So first up, we've got Richard. Richard Austin is a business recovery partner, and Richard's going to just build further on that RETHINK framework and give some examples as well as to how BDO has supported charities through implementing some of this change already. Then we'll have Matthew, also a business recovery partner. Matthew is going to touch on some changes that came into law on the 25th of June, the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, and just give us an overview of some of the key changes and how these benefit charities that reshape operations to face the challenges that we're about to see and face. Helen will then join us. Helen O'Kane is in our M&A team, and Helen's been working with a number of charities and corporates across the years, looking at acquisitions, mergers, disposals, as that strategic direction evolves. Obviously, now we're in a post-COVID world. And then finally, welcome Laura Norton, also in the M&A team as well, who will draw on experience across the corporate sector and look at charity retail to provide some of the key issues that we're facing and that digital transformation, which I know I've been discussing with a number of our clients. So if I hand over now to Richard to take us through.
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everyone. So I've got a few slides I'll take you through just to talk through the RETHINK model that BDO have developed and some key points associated with that in terms of strategy and operations. And then I'll talk you through an example of who we work with the client we work with from the charity side, who we're actually currently working with as well to sort of help push through change in the current environment. So hopefully you can see the slide here, the RETHINK model. This is something that BDO have developed over the last few months to kind of recognise the key stages that organisations go through, be it companies or charities or any other organisation. But effectively, there are three stages to that framework. And you'll probably, as we go through it, you'll probably recognise which phase that you're in as an organisation as we go through them. But effectively, once COVID kicked off, there's very much a react phase in the first phase, which is very much how do I batten down the hatches, how do I safeguard my organisation, what do I need to do? And that includes looking at what government is doing, what available funding might be available in terms of furloughing or delays of payments, etc. So, you know, quite a few or most businesses and organisations have been through that phase. They may be still slightly in there, but most have come through that phase and have moved into the next phase. The next phase is resilience, which is very much how do I, as an organisation, function in the existing COVID environment. So during lockdown, what do I need to do? How do I maintain my organisation? How do I maintain it running? How do I reduce services or resources to make sure that I can come through the other side? Third phase is what we call realise, and that's how do you come out the other side? So how do I emerge from a lockdown situation and flourish in the future new normal environment? Now, sitting over the top of that is what we call rethink, which is the whole process of stepping back and really understanding whether your business or organisation is actually set up and organised structurally in the right way so that it can succeed in that realise phase. One thing that is really important to note is that during previous recessions and similar but not the same situations as COVID that we're currently in, you'll have a few organisations that will fail during the react phase, which is typically organisations that have been failing already, are on the edge and get tipped over the edge purely by that shock to the system up front. But the real problem usually exists during what we call recovery, which is the overlap between resilience and realise, and the majority of organisations usually fail during that phase. So that's one thing to be very much aware of. The other thing that is probably worth noting here is that I'm sure that most of you have strategies in place and have plans, but what I'll talk through next is making sure that those plans and strategies are robust enough and are fit for purpose in a new future environment. So in terms of strategic considerations, one thing, as I said, hopefully is that you have a strategic plan. First thing is to make sure you have one. If you have one, fantastic. If you don't have one, you need to get one relatively quickly. Within that strategy, you need to start thinking about what the future looks like and whether that strategy that you have is capable of succeeding in that future environment. And that means looking at your organisation through a number of different lenses and asking yourself quite a few difficult questions. So questions you might want to ask in a future environment are things like, for example, new services and products. Are there new services and products you need to think about? Or are there old services and products that are no longer fit for purpose in that future environment? Another thing is, how do you serve your customers? I think that's particularly relevant, and I'm sure Laura will come on to that in the future of this presentation around how do you serve your customers and what are your customers actually looking for in the future environment? And will that customer base change off the back of that? Other questions you might be able to ask yourself is, what are your peers doing? Are there other organisations out there doing innovative things that may make sense for you? And how will that impact your revenues and cost base and feed into projections for your organisation in the future? In terms of that strategic view, I think the other thing I'd like to pick up is that in the future, there may be certain parts of your organisation that are no longer core for you, and you might be seeking to divest those certain areas. The other flip side of that is there may be opportunities for you to look at potential mergers and acquisitions in the future as well, to take advantage of other parts of the industry changing as we go through this change process. So I think the point here is that there are risks that need to be mitigated, but there are also potential options that need to be looked at. But underlying all of that is a question of making sure that you prioritise and focus on the things that really matter. I think it's probably fair to say that there are so many things, so many activities changing so quickly at the moment, it's difficult to work out which ones that really matter. But it's critical at that strategic level to take a look and say, what are the 5 to 10 things that are really important for us to make sure that we succeed in the future and focus on those. The reality is that you'll get most of it right, some of it you'll get wrong, but you just need to make sure that you're not spreading yourself too thin in terms of that strategic view. Now, once you've taken a look at your strategy, the next question is, well, how do I make that a reality on the ground? And that comes through to looking at the operational considerations you might need to think about. Again, in the future, we don't know whether we're going to come out of the current situation smoothly or bumpily. I think the reality is it will be bumpy, but we don't know whether economically it's going to be L-shaped, V-shaped, W-shaped, U-shaped, whatever. So any operational plan that you have in place needs to be sufficiently agile and resilient to deal with whatever is thrown at it. With previous clients and existing clients, what we do in this situation is start to test scenarios on those operating plans to make sure that you can turn the volume up or turn the volume back down on certain elements of your operating plan to make sure that it's capable of dealing with whatever's thrown at it. The other question that comes up quite regularly is, well, how do I know when to start doing things and what order do I need to do these things? That requires quite a lot of thinking in terms of what is a leading indicator that would identify that it's time to start coming out of hibernation. The other thing to think about there is to make sure that as you start emerging, that you are able to do things in the right order, because you can potentially expend a lot of cash by doing things in the wrong order. Just adding to that, finally, is making sure that risks are identified and mitigated in the right way, and that in terms of service lines and functional capability within your organisation, really think about what level of support is required as you come out to the other end. Just taking you through a recent client example, we're actually working with this charity at the moment, very much a large UK charity, has had quite a stable environment to function within over the last, probably fair to say 20 years. Obviously, COVID has had quite a significant impact on them, and they've looked internally in terms of what their strategy should be and have redefined that for themselves, but they were seeking support to help them translate that into a functioning operating plan. So historically, they've not really done a huge amount of change management, hadn't had to. Clearly, in the current environment, there's a huge amount of change management that's required, and we were supporting them and are still supporting them to really define a program that allows them to focus on the things that really matter, making sure that they have a sustainable organisation internally so that they can continue to run a change program without support, but also have the opportunity to tap into external resource as and when they feel that there's a requirement to really kick the tires on the program and make sure it works. But at the moment, they've got 48 projects planned. Those are in waves. Wave 1 is ongoing at the moment and includes things like getting people and staff back into their existing office space where required and where necessary, but also mitigating risk in terms of how their virtual office environment functions. Just as a sort of quick conclusion, then I'll hand over to Matthew. I think the point here is that you really need to step back and really have a think about what your organisation is all about, what your strategy is it fit for purpose, and is there an operating plan that sits behind it that will enable the delivery of that strategy in a very much changing environment. It will be bumpy, mistakes will be made, but if you don't have a plan, then you can't really work towards anything, you can't change it. So first thing is, yeah, everything's evolving, we're all learning as we go along. Second point is definitely have a plan. Third point is definitely have a plan B and potentially have a plan C as well. And finally, you don't need to do this alone. There is capability out there to support you to, one, stress test your strategy, but also help support that change activity that's undoubtedly required. So with that, what I will do is I'll hand you over to Matthew, and he'll talk to you about the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act and what it means for charity. Matthew, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Tate. I'm a business restructuring partner, as introduced by Jill. I'm going to take you through the Corporate Insolvency Governance Act that came into law on the 25th of June. We were expecting this act to come in towards the end of July. It was a little bit of a surprise, actually, to a number of people that it went to Parliament, both houses, pretty quickly. But anyway, good news that it did. So just to provide a bit of context, what I'm trying to cover quite quickly here is that Richard has just talked to you about what we think you need to do and the way to think about it. What I'm going to talk to you is what we think is something you should be considering as to how to do something and how to make the changes that may become required. And that's broadly what the Corporate Insolvency Governance Act, or CIGAR, manages to provide a framework for. The UK currently is ranked 14th in business restructuring on the World Bank's restructuring and insolvency table, which is reasonably good news, but frankly, it's not that great. There are many other countries that are above us. And the reason it's important because it deals with the ability to have flexibility and innovation within restructuring that doesn't necessarily mean insolvency. And the points I'm making on this slide bear exactly that point, which is firstly, the UK has a much more focused creditor insolvency and restructuring regime. What that means is that decisions relating to restructuring options tend to be focused on the amount of return to a creditor, as opposed to what is required to change a business in order for it to have a chance of successfully trading it out or indeed through the current issue. That will be the same within the corporate world as it is within the charity sector. You'll see at the bottom I put a reason, I'm afraid, it's sort of not a great quote, but it sort of does, it makes the point for me. That and also to identify the difference between restructuring and turnaround. The way I'm talking about it, restructuring is where you financially make changes to the balance sheet. That could be to lending terms, commercial terms, corporate terms, the contracts that are negotiated in the terms with landlords. That's restructuring. It's recutting the business cloth. Turnaround is the way that you do so, how you acquire markets, how you might consider, for example, merging with another charity to share resources, the manner in which you undertake your activity. What the new regime, the new CIGAR regime, is moving away from this creditor-led insolvency regime into a non-insolvency regime that is led with a strong influence of the court, but also led and hopefully innovated by the trustees or directors of either the charity or maybe its trading subsidiaries. There have been reasons why we haven't rushed into this in the past, and that's because, and which is now helped by the current Act, which is that there has been some real difficulty, I think, for trustees and directors to maintain their duties within a legal framework which would appear to point the finger at them if anything went wrong. And what this Act does is attempt to address that very significant problem. So as I said, came into law on the 25th of June. It's a big Act. It has lots of things in it. Some of them which have grabbed the headlines are temporary measures, and that's, for example, the suspension of winding up petitions, the suspension of commercial evictions, changes to wrongful trading, which does impact trustees and directors alike, have all effectively been suspended, and that suspension has been extended to the 30th of September. Ipso facto clauses, which are clauses which contractually allow a supplier to stop supply to a company that enters into an insolvency process or restructuring processes, are effectively outlawed for larger and medium-sized enterprises. But the bit I'm focusing on here is the monitor and moratorium, which is known as the breathing space, as well as the restructuring plan, which, as I say, is a non-insolvency methodology by which significant changes, turnaround and restructuring can be brought about to an entity, whether it be charitable or corporate. Just emphasised in the next bullet point that this absolutely does apply to charity firms in a letter from the sponsoring MP to the Minister for Charity. There are some minor exclusions. Credit unions, for example, are excluded. There again, as are all other financial institutions in the corporate world. So what is the moratorium and monitor? It's quite a hefty piece of legislation, so I'm going to have to be deliberately very high level. Firstly, the moratorium can be filed by a director/trustee. It's filed at the court, and as long as you have someone who has to be an insolvency practitioner, but as long as someone who is prepared to act as the monitor says they believe there is a reasonable prospect of there being a restructure, then there is a 20-day moratorium, that's 20 business days. It's very significant, stops all sorts of insolvency proceedings commencing or being furthered, stops landlords taking possession proceedings, stops HP goods or retention of title goods being repossessed by the owners. So it's an absolute freeze. But this, we know, by reference to our friends in Canada, is a very successful methodology. It does allow a proper breathing space, which is one thing that has not really been availed to UK, either charitable sector or indeed corporate sector, enough time for them to truly start to consider what the restructuring plan would be. And the even better thing is that the moratorium, the initial 20 days, can be extended relatively straightforwardly by a further 20 days, and indeed extended beyond that, as long as the court can be persuaded and or as long as the creditors can be persuaded that there is grounds to extend it. Now that you don't have to use this for a restructuring plan, but you can use it to provide the protection. I suggest on this talk that it's very likely to be used in combination. And one of the things you'll see on the bottom of that list of 4 things is that a restructuring plan can be proposed during the moratorium period. So the key, therefore, is what is the restructuring plan? Well, other than providing the parameters by which it is delivered, there is no structure to it that is prescribed in law. In other words, as described by the sponsoring directors and or trustees, usually I would expect in support of a restructuring firm who's assisted in its proposing, as well as most probably legal insight, it is the plan that is placed before creditors and there is a vote on it, and it's a straightforward, simple majority vote. The difference here is that creditors who dissent can be crammed down, i.e. they could be, if they are in the minority, they can be forced to be bound to it. And unlike a CVA, secured creditors voting within their class can also, if they dissent, can also be bound by it. And once it has gone through, it is court sanctioned. So therefore, it is legally binding and has full force and effect from the court in terms of its implementation. So our view, it can allow for time, innovation, flexibility to propose a very significant rebasing change, fundamental change indeed, to the way that a charity operates. And indeed, it might allow for mergers of those institutions, it could allow for writing off debt, it could allow for renegotiation of landlord terms. Just because just to note, because we sit on the Charity Commission's advisory panel, the Charity Commission of States stated that they would always take a proportionate approach. What that means is that they won't hold it against the charity, I believe, if they implement a restructuring plan, because there are some issues relating to the Charities Act, but I suspect they will be ironed out over time. And I suppose that's an area which I'll effectively end my talk on, which is that because this is new law and it has gone through Parliament very quickly, there are likely to be some challenges to it, and that comes from a different form of interpretation. But we're relatively hopeful that our experience means that we can foresee those. So that's the matters that I have wished to cover with you. I'm now going to pass over to Helen O'Kane.
So hi, I'm Helen O'Kane. I'm a partner in the M&A team, so mergers and acquisitions team. I advise people on buying and selling businesses, raising funding and considering strategic change. I'm going to focus in a little bit more on strategy and think perhaps in terms of medium, longer term, and consider perhaps some of the strategic implications of what's going on around us at the moment in the context of the not-for-profit space. I work both in the not-for-profit space and the for-profit space, advising companies on all sides of acquisitions and disposals, and I'll try and draw in some of my observations from working with all types of different organisations and how they approach some of the strategic change that you may consider going forward. So clearly, COVID has accelerated change, and I suppose a question I would have is this a catalyst for broader change, and should this be used as an opportunity, as Richard said, the social direction of an organisation and the strategic direction of an organisation is the key element to be building the change in the short and medium term around, but should this be considered for a catalyst for broader change within an organisation? What we find is that within the not-for-profit sector there is a strong sense of legacy, a strong sense of having maintained and be building for the future an organisation that will carry on for a long number of years, and it has a sense of permanence. But the question would be, with all of this accelerating change going on in the area around us, do we need to be asking some hard questions about some of the operating models in the sector? So an example of that might be, was sufficient cash being generated for investment and growth pre-COVID, and what does that look like now in the environment going forward? Another question might be, had the world already changed around current strategy? And was the purpose and legacy that the organisation started life with, is that still the right purpose and legacy, or should there be a slight change to it to reflect the current environment? And I think absorbing all of that and thinking about change at the moment and reacting to COVID, where will the organisation be in 2030? How do you differentiate your market position or your position to attract funding? Is it that you're a market disruptor? Is it that you are reaching certain members of society that others can't? Is it that you're higher quality? And to give a context for that, I guess quite a bit of our work has been in the social care part of the not-for-profit sector and the for-profit sector. And clearly when not-for-profits first started offering care for vulnerable members of society, they were quite often the only providers available in the marketplace, and there weren't alternatives, and they were providing this new and very important urgent service. As time has moved on, there are now a number of organisations who offer the same type of service, equally high quality. So what is the differentiator for your place in that kind of market? So we are involved in a number of strategic discussions at the moment, and there are some themes that I just thought it would be helpful to pull out. A number of boards and management teams are very much diving into what is the true cost position of various operations that are being running, and I suppose here I'm talking about a lot of the operational businesses that the not-for-profit sector may be running within their overall organisations. Understanding margins, understanding how that benchmarks against other organisations, as Richard said, using comparisons is a very helpful thing to do at this time, and to help you think about how to develop and change strategy potentially going forward. So thinking about what are your margins compared to others in the not-for-profit and also in the profit sector. How are you allocating costs even between different parts of your business, between property, where are central costs being allocated? Are they being allocated correctly? And does looking at central costs and property and margins give you an opportunity to think about how you could more fundamentally restructure a business? For example, if you're lucky enough to have a property in central London, it may be that that with the changes that will be coming in workforces going forward, there are some opportunities to restructure how the workforce is allocated between different offices. That may help release some of the central cost pressure and may help with some of the margins that are being perhaps slightly falsely allocated to operating businesses but really relate to central services. Focusing in on operational businesses, we spent a lot of time assessing performance and looking at the potential value that operational businesses within charities may deliver. Assessing whether it's appropriate time to sell them or actually to build them, and as Richard said, to consider making acquisitions. It may be that there is no intention to part with these operating businesses, but at least understanding how they compare to others and the potential value that they could release enables a board to make decisions based on understanding all of the options available to them. Now, we're having similar conversations with a range of corporates as well. We see carve-outs in mergers and acquisitions from large corporates being one of the themes that will be driving mergers and acquisitions over the next 6 to 12 months. and it applies also in the not-for-profit sector. However, perhaps one of the observations from the not-for-profit sector is that at times these decisions that can be fundamental decisions take a period of time to consider, agree, implement and fund. And so starting sooner rather than later to think about this more radical change towards what you may need to be in 2030 alongside the changes that are being forced upon you in the shorter term, we think embedding into decision-making and strategic discussions, it's critical to be looking at the longer term and shorter term. Moving on to some examples of the types of transactions that we've been involved with and trying to just pull out some of the themes and lessons that have arisen during those processes. So on this slide, we set out a range of examples, starting with, I guess, as a sliding scale from disposals of non-core assets through to more significant disposals for the organisation involved. So Scope was a more radical restructure which involved all of their care services being divested, which was 50 services, and enabled the organisation to restructure and repurpose and refocus itself on more broadly reaching out across society. So these transactions have been driven by quite often either a decision about a non-core organisation through to a radical restructure of the overall strategy of a business going forward. In all of them, we've very much worked through helping to develop a matrix of working through the pros and cons of considering a strategic disposal, of assessing what are the important considerations from all of the stakeholders' perspective, and really ensuring that the legacy of these organisations can be continued going forward. So these are not transactions that are from a position of weakness from the businesses that have been disposed. They have been from a position of strength, and the businesses have been invested in to drive them forward and help build them outside of their disposing parent going forward. Some of the issues that we've done a lot of work on have been in relation to tax and pensions, others in relation to communications and ensuring that the communications strategy is clearly understood and the organisations are able to clearly explain why they've pursued various strategic routes. Property, Charities Act, KPIs, understanding how to present these businesses to corporate investors and professional investors has been important as well. Others have decided not to pursue of this nature, and actually, once they've understood the benchmarks, have understood that they have assets that they view as core and would like to continue to develop going forward. Going through the process of the benchmarking and considering the options has helped them understand the value of the organisation that they have. So just drawing a conclusion on these points, I think the lessons I would draw out from this is keep thinking longer term, seek to understand the market position and what you see as that market position going forward. Consider your funding requirements because disposals can help raise funds, obviously, to help grow core parts of the business. Leading on to, can disposals help? And my final thought is, will there be further mergers and consolidation in the sector? And with that, I will pass over to Laura, who will discuss the retail considerations in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Helen. So my colleagues have taken you through the journey of some of the operational and strategic considerations that all organisations are going to be facing as we come out of what is quite an unusual time for everyone, both not-for-profit organisations and corporates. I spend a lot of my time within the consumer landscape, and so what I want to do is just highlight some of the changes that we have been seeing from the UK retail consumer for probably the last 12, 18 months. But certainly CV19 has accelerated trends that we thought might be facing anyone with a retail footprint over the last 2 years. We thought we probably had another couple of years before people had to implement real change. And we've seen that change within the last 2-3 months. And businesses are having to operate very, very differently as we come out of the current CV lockdown and into a reopening world with social distancing. So prior to CV19, as I mentioned, we were seeing some significant changes to the UK consumer. There was a real move to the consumer not wanting to spend too much time walking and browsing around stores. They would typically be going into a retail shop if they were out doing something else, whether that being going for dinner or going for coffee with friends. There was also a change that people were looking towards sustainability, a trend that people had generally a lot less stuff. And so, again, people thinking about how they could purchase goods, but in a sustainable manner. Another large trend we were seeing was health and wellness, and a move to old not necessarily being something that had its day and coming back and as everyone classed it, with consumer vintage. Clearly, some of these trends were very much faced around a younger demographic. The older demographic certainly was keeping to a more traditional footprint. They still would like to get out and spend some time. But I think, again, this move with COVID has changed everybody and every demographic around what they want to do. The consumer, again, being socially more responsible, which I think for not-for-profit organisations, again, is a trend that we were seeing start to come through, but one that could really count to how, in a positive sense, CV19 and an acceleration of that could lead to the not-for-profit organisations and their retail footprints actually coming out of the current situation quite well. So where are we? We've had a period of unprecedented change. As Jill alluded to, you are all facing a real challenge where trading income for not-for-profit organisations and every business is going to be hit coming out of CV19 and into 2021. This is just a sentiment monitor that we have been part of that clearly highlights that people are finding the aspect of retail and social distancing something that becomes quite daunting for them. So what does that mean for retailers? It means that people just aren't going to be stood outside in a queue waiting for stores to open. They'll still be looking for different ways to shop. And I think that has only accelerated the move to a digital platform, which is one that we've been seeing come to the forefront over the last 12 to 18 months here in the UK. So I think any charity, anyone listening to us today that has any kind of retail operations, just opening the doors, looking towards the social distancing measures that the government has put in place and hoping that they'll go away at some point in the future, probably is going to face some very difficult challenges. I think we were seeing a consumer that was changing already, and the period of lockdown has cemented that change and accelerated it, as well as probably pushing it through all of the demographics in which you would be looking to attract into any of your retail stores. The biggest fundamental change that we've seen is that people have just become a digital consumer. So even those that would have been quite fearful of shopping online and using digital portals, they have had to learn during the lockdown period, and the UK economy has benefited quite well. It's one of the only global economies that has actually been able to ship non-essential goods during the lockdown period. Other geographies, it's only been essential items, but here in the UK, it's been everything. And so what we've been able to do as consumers is we've been able to source all of the things we might want, even though we've not been able to leave our homes. Now, as we walk into a world where retail has social distancing, you can't necessarily get into a store and people aren't looking at queuing unless it's something that they feel they need to go and get. People are still using those digital platforms in which to browse and shop. So as you sit there looking forward, how can you adapt and embrace that change around digital? When I was speaking to my colleagues, I think it's very easy to say, go and set yourself up a web platform, start listing your items. But actually, for not-for-profit organisations, particularly where you've got a number of standalone stores, that is not something that is easy to do. And certainly what we see across the board, it's actually a very expensive thing to deploy. It is not just as easy as having a website, turning it on and selling stuff. And So one of the things that I think I would urge you to think about is, are there commercial partnerships which allow you to access those online platforms and allow you to access that digital consumer? One of the things, as Helen was alluding to, that you have to be very focused coming out of this period of change, and actually putting something into your operations that you just don't understand and don't know may not be the right thing to do when there's other things to focus upon. But there's certainly some very good corporate partners out there who may be able to support you in that change to accessing the digital consumer that you could work with and still generate that cash for your organisation to allow you to mitigate some of that exposed risk that Jill was alluding to of a significant fall in your trading income of 57%. One of the other things that I think we're going to see change, and one of the other areas where you as organisations will need to adapt to the consumer, is that people are not going to be browsing in the same way. They won't have the time, nor will you be able to allow people to walk around your retail stores and browse through all of the items that you have. And so how can you create your retail stores in a way that they have a purpose? Whether you have to look at the estate and create certain stores to access certain things so the consumer knows. For example, as I've put there, you may have a store that does just the vintage clothing, a trend, as I alluded to before, that's fast growing, and one that accesses all demographics. One that perhaps takes all of your luxury, more expensive items that you may have had across a number of stores and puts them under one roof. So again, people will drive with a purpose to come and look at those items, and other things that you may have retailed across a small store, allowing someone to come into the store and browse, actually creating those areas where people just know what they're coming for and come with a purpose, will allow you to have a higher rate of sell-through of products in your store when people just don't have that same browse time. I think going back to my previous slide with the anxiety of the consumer just around going back to a shopping experience, is there something around a need to change to have larger, out-of-town, more accessible stores than those smaller, quite intimate stores on the high street that the not-for-profit sector has been well known for? I think that's something that I would urge you to think about as you work through your strategy, work through your operational change, and as Helen said, look at those areas where you can make profit and return from the operations that you have. I think at the moment there is so much uncertainty about where the consumer will want to shop. Racing and just having a number of out-of-town retail stores, I think we feel that the consumer will have issue with shopping across the board, whether that be on high street or whether that be in large out-of-town stores. Actually, I think if I was to focus on one thing, it would be about creating your stores that have purpose, that have a reason for someone to come, that they can walk through the door, shop, exit, but actually you'll be able to get a higher level of return per footfall than you have done previously. And my final point, I guess, as this consumer change continues to happen, is it's going to be very important to remain relevant. Going back to my first slide where I talked about sustainability, social impact, all of those trends that we've seen around health and wellness, the consumer has changed in the UK. They are more socially responsible. I think there is a real opportunity for the not-for-profit sector to really advance in the current climate of a world where people just want less stuff. And as part of that, what you'll be able to do is create an environment that encourages both from the young to the older demographic to see the not-for-profit stores as being somewhere that forms part of their shopping experience. And again, that will allow you to really benefit. So whilst the headlines of 50% reduction in trading income look quite scary moving into 2021, I think there are some certain trends that are happening with the UK consumer that have been accelerated by CV19, which will allow you to benefit if you can put a very consumer-facing strategy on the agenda of all of this operational change. So I will now pass back to Jill for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really interesting. All of those sessions have really resonated with me and the conversations that I've been having with charity trustees and management over the last few months. Actually, the socially responsible customer is really interesting, because that's been, a number of our charities have been lobbying and campaigning for that type of change for quite some time. So it's great to see that is eventually coming through. Helen, we lost you just at the beginning of your example slide around the Canal and Rivers Trust and Leonard Cheshire. And it actually comes and links to one of the questions that we had coming through, which was the Charity Commission's view on selling off assets. So I just wondered whether you wanted to just do a little quick recap on those two examples and possibly pick up your experience with the Charity Commission when they've been selling off parts of the business as well, please.
Sure. So on the two that we talked about, on the slide, it was a sliding scale. I was trying to say work in terms of the relative size of the disposal to the overall organisation. So Canal River Trust, we helped them dispose of an operating subsidiary that they had, which ran inland marinas on the inland water systems. And it wasn't really part of the overall strategy. So on Leonard Cheshire, it was a disposal from the core part of their organisation, which is delivering care through care homes. And these were a number of care homes that were less in line with their future strategy. So in the care home market, there are a number of strategies that are available through care homes, residential supported living, community services. So that was a disposal of part of a strategic business, and then through to scope, which was the disposal of, I suppose, a big part of their operation. So that was kind of the point of talking through those perhaps three case studies, because they were different. They had different drivers in terms of how core they were prior to the disposals being pursued. So you have to go through the appropriate steps to demonstrate that the board has considered all of the obligations that they should do as a charitable organisation in assessing the disposal. So it's quite an important piece of work that has to be undertaken, but it is, when done properly, then it is not a block to seeking disposals. It's just ensuring that the appropriate process is followed and well documented, and you've received appropriate legal and financial advice in relation to it.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got one question coming in. If one wanted to explore the possibility of a merger as a not-for-profit, then where can we learn more about others who want to merge? So looking at potential merger partners there, where can they find that information?
Yes, again, that's a really good question. I think the key thing in the sector is finding a cultural fit. It's really important that you are potentially moving forward with a partner who shares the same values, has the same outlook on whichever sector you happen to be in. So I think we find that a lot of the mergers are through either existing relationships or through targeted approaches, rather than there's a kind of a meeting board somewhere to kind of swap ideas. It tends to be through relationships and then really clearly thinking about the type of organisation that would be a fit. And as I say, therefore, through targeted approaches. So that would be kind of my initial answer to that question.
Yeah, I think right, Helen. I think if I look at the mergers that we've seen across the sector, they've been built on a number of long-standing relationships, and often, they will have had those discussions for a number of times throughout history, and there've been various barriers to merger. With the financial position we're seeing it at the moment, I think that will push through a number, because I think we'll be seeing a lot in financial distress to be able to merge and to take advantage of cutting those cost bases down. I think the other point that I would add there is your advisors and your audit as well, because we often get some of our clients asking, we would like to take opportunities, and do you know anybody that would be interested, so give us make introductions.
Yeah, and I suppose it's picking up on that targeted approach. So typically you would have somebody who would help you with that. So it would be the same, for us, as if you were looking for a party to acquire in the corporate world, we could sit down with you, map out what it was that you were looking for and find the appropriate fits or discuss the different options, because it may be that ideally it would be an organisation of a certain size in a certain area and it ends up being a different organisation in a different place, but the fit is still the right one for the organisation going forward. So yeah, there isn't, I suppose, a forum out there to discuss it more broadly. It's really kind of having those discussions with advisors, and absolutely we can help facilitate those discussions.
Thanks, Helen. That's great. I've got a question from Matthew. That moratorium protects against HMRC.
So just reflect that question, make sure I got it right. Does the moratorium protect against claims of HMRC? The short, if I've got that right, the short answer is absolutely it does, or what's called pre-moratorium debt. So let's say broadly that's going to be PAYE, NIC, and maybe if it's a trading subsidiary, let's talk about VAT. Those will all be captured and held, and yes, that's part of the moratorium. If you incur VAT, PAYE, NIC in the moratorium period, the monitor has to confirm that amount, the moratorium period debt, can be paid, because you have to pay your amounts during the moratorium period. But the historic stuff, no, you don't. One other point just to make on that, there is a change in the law coming in December dealing with the reintroduction of preferential status for HMRC for PAYE and NIC, so they basically, and VAT, so they basically sit in advance of the rest of unsecured creditors. We think that is an appalling decision. We do not support that as a firm, and we would not be surprised if the Chancellor actually delays the implementation of that to support businesses going forward.
Thank you, Matthew. That's really helpful. Got one final observation. One of our participants thought that the point around COVID being a catalyst of broader change was from face-to-face training over to virtual, and that being a change that they'd wanted to do for some time, but people were resistant. Now they've embraced it, and I would definitely say that where I sit on the board of a small charity, we've gone from face-to-face training, face-to-face events to virtual pretty much overnight, and it's amazing as to how quickly I think charities have reacted. But you're right, we do need trailblazers, early adopters to make these things work and show how it can transform very, very quickly. So I think we're out of time now. So much for your questions. A huge thank you to our four speakers. Thank you for attending, and a huge thank you to Hannah, who's working very much to make sure this is seamless. We will send round, as we said, a recording of the seminar, and the link to our future ones will be on the 28th of July. So thank you very, very much, and we hope to see you at the next one. Take care.